Energy poverty is more dire in some African countries than others. Likewise in Asia. Overcoming this challenge requires collaborative efforts between the public and the private sector. To shed light on energy access development, I'm joined by Kristina Skierka, CEO of Power for All. Kristina coordinates a global team alongside country-led initiatives in East and West Africa, as well as in India. She was featured in the African Power and Energy Elites published by ESI Africa and was a finalist in the 2020 Power Industry Leader of the Year. Welcome, Kristina.
Oh, thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Thank you for making the time for us. I think you will agree with me that without a reliable and affordable energy source for all, it will be difficult to end energy poverty. This calls for an integrated energy approach. Can you tell us a little bit about what is integrated energy?
I can. And before I start, let me just also just send my best wishes out to everybody participating in the digital festival. This has been such an unusual year, and it's wonderful that we're all finding ways to connect and engage in conversations like this, which are really about what we can do, not the environment we've been forced to live in for the last number of months. And just a bit about Power for All. So Power for All is a global campaign with over 300 partners stretching across the public and private sectors. We're all united in a fight, really, to accelerate the end of energy poverty. And we do that through a combination of local action and global advocacy. So in the case of local action, we'll be talking a little bit later today about our work in Uganda with some great partners on the ground, including Umeme. But the idea of Utilities 2.0 and integrated energy fits perfectly into the concept of global advocacy. So with that, if I had to elaborate on the term of integrated energy, the first thing I would say is it's a relatively new term. I've worked in the energy sector for literally 25 years, and historically what we talked about, especially in my work in the United States, was focused on integrated planning, which really means involving the estimation of future energy demand and then the identification of an appropriate mix of technologies to meet the demand. But the challenge with just sort of a replication of the developed world approach to focus on what's actually going on in energy poor countries doesn't take into concept the complete variability and different types of demand that we see in much of Africa and Asia. So as a result, my partner in crime and I, Rebecca Shirley, my chief research officer, we started thinking a couple years ago of what would be this future of energy conversation that we've heard so much of in the West. What would be the version of that that's relevant for developing countries or energy poor countries? So about 2 years ago, thanks to the generous support of the Rockefeller Foundation, we got together a really incredible group of about 30 individuals, leaders in the energy sector in their own right, about half from the global north, half from the global south, and about half from decentralized and half from the centralized world. And together we got together to figure out what this definition would be and what does integrated energy mean. And that's where we really came up with this concept of Utilities 2.0, which is focused on bringing together decentralized and centralized energy to catalyze the research, engineering, regulation, and political will to create faster, more reliable access for all. So there's several components to integrated energy that stretch literally across policy to products and technologies and even processes and how we interrelate together.
Speaking of policy, then it speaks to now planning, as you had mentioned, and then about estimating energy demand. And then wouldn't maybe utilities see this maybe as a threat to them? So now my question is, why should utilities in poor energy countries care about working with decentralized renewable energy sector to end energy poverty?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And, having worked in this sector for over a decade now, the decentralized side of the equation, I can tell you that early days utilities didn't really know what to make of this sector, and in many cases didn't really see its value. In fact, in early days, I used to work with a company called D-Light, one of the sort of fast movers early on in the decentralized space. And we had utilities who actually wanted to work with us as a CSR initiative, as a sort of giveaway. And that just didn't really make sense, because in fact, what decentralized was offering was a way to solve utilities problems for them and achieve for a country an energy for all agenda. I mean, let's go back to basics, right? So we all know that SDG is essentially way behind where it needs to be, with 10 years to go for universal access for all. And for the most part, the central grid has been the, I would say, the connection of choice for development dollars. And what we've seen is that global investment has actually gone up 2.5x over 15 years. But yet at the same time, we're seeing the numbers of the energy poor not really decline in significant amounts. So something's not working. And when you look ahead to achieving some of the national targets that have been set in countries like Nigeria, Uganda, Ethiopia, that you're going to have to be looking at literally hundreds, millions of connections a year in order to achieve these targets. But there's limits to what we call this utility 1.0 mindset. And really, to say more about that, utilities everywhere are struggling to meet their provision of service obligations. And, that shows up in all sorts of different ways. It's unprofitable customer connections, over electrification, dealing with peak demand issues, and capital constraints among them. And at this point, it's also not a win for the customer, this current approach. So in many cases, customers are being forced to conform and deal with a situation where, they're being asked to pay for $2,000 worth of connections, which for many of the unconnected, that's already their annual income. New energy customers, we've seen time and time again, don't always know exactly how to use energy in the best way possible, and they need education and need to come up what we've called the energy ladder in our sector. And at the end of the day, the energy poverty problem lies largely in peri-urban and rural areas, places that the grid isn't always the best solution for. So as opposed to seeing decentralized renewables as a threat, the hope with this Utilities 2.0 initiative is that centralized utilities actually see decentralized renewables, or DRE, as a partner to solve and address their biggest challenges in universal electrification.
And of which now my question was going to go into, I know that your organization is involved in the Utilities 2.0 energy pilot. Any work has been done yet? Like, what can you tell us about it? Because I know that it's pilot stages.
Yes, no, and thanks so much. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. But let me start just a little bit sort of stepping back. As I was talking about how we all sort of came together as a sector, a global energy sector, both centralized and decentralized proponents of doing everything we could to accelerate the end of energy poverty. What we found is that neither centralized nor decentralized energy is purpose-built to actually solve energy poverty alone. You look at this in a number of ways. You've got utilities suffering in many energy poor countries with incredible transmission and distribution losses, oftentimes 5 to 10 times what developed world counterparts might be looking. You've got over 500 hours per year of service interruptions in some countries, and an average utility deficit of about 10 cents per kilowatt hour, which can add up to ultimately almost 2% of some nations' GDPs. So this new framework, which is what we're testing in Uganda, and I'll get to the description of that in a minute, this new framework is really about communicating carefully, strongly, and in a collaborative way that traditional utilities don't need to solve the access problems by themselves. But this requires actually a mindset, and it has to be about coming from a place of collaboration, really needed to advance this new future. So the idea, the concept that we're testing out starts with a fundamental belief that by working with both sectors' comparative advantages, we'll actually be able to see not only some incredible innovations that will result in speed, but also some technology and business model innovations that will reduce costs. And so let's just talk about what those comparative advantages are for a second. So on one side, its centralized strengths are strong infrastructure, an incredible brand, by the way. The grid power is still considered a premium in many places. Incumbency, so existing, known, believed in, and also scale. There's an incredible amount of grids around the world and a lot of connections compared to where decentralized energy has been able to get so far. In addition, you've got low cost, long-term debt available to many utilities and a significant customer base. And by the way, utilities, especially some like UMEME, have figured out some amazing advancements in billings and collections that also helps keep and attract a deep bench of expertise. So that's on the centralized side. Now, the benefits and sort of the unique approaches of the decentralized community that's really come into its own in the last decade is the modularity approach. It's the ability to be incentivized and have competition to connect the most in the best way possible. There's incredibly agile companies that can adapt, not just from a business model perspective and which countries they're operating in, but actually add to their systems in a modular way. So as people come up that energy ladder that I mentioned earlier, we can actually scale systems alongside them and grow not only the size of kilowatt peak that's available in a given moment, but also the appliances now and the machinery that can be powered by those things. It's an interesting and growing space for investors, which is super promising. And one of the things that I think I've noticed the most is the incredible ability of the decentralized energy community to really focus on customer-centric approaches, a deep relationship and commitment to working with those customers, and the ability to add on ancillary products and services. So that level of innovation is something that we just thought back at the kickoff of Utilities 2.0 that we thought was ripe for the testing. And so now on to the testing, to your point. What can I tell you about the pilot? Well, the idea is to really test the benefits that I just laid out of technology integration, as well as demonstrate the benefits of integrated public-private approaches. So really, this is, yes, the first of its particular kind of pilot, but Power for All also works with a network of other companies and nonprofits trying to test other models. That includes some work with Tata Power in India, Rocky Mountain Institute's work in Nigeria with what's called the Under the Grid model, and as well as Connexa, also working in Nigeria. But the idea of the particular pilot in Uganda is really to see what working together to plan out an energy site can result in, along with innovative finance, and in the hopes that it can reduce connection costs, accelerate pace and affordability. In addition, there's a real belief, and part of what we're testing is that integrated technology can both improve the reliability of connections and reduce grid losses. And then finally, that data and finance innovations can drive demand stimulation for all energy companies on both sides of the wires. So we're working in a couple areas in Uganda with a number of partners, including UMEME, Equatorial Power, East Africa Power, and Intergrow, along with Phoenix, to really test an area that represents a challenge area to UMEME, but is also quite typical for many utilities. And in this, it's about peri-urban mixed communities that have a growing demand, but don't yet quite generate enough load to really offset the cost of connecting. So the thesis here is that a grid integrated decentralized tech can both reduce distribution and generation costs of new customer connections by also providing a higher service and reliability at a faster rate of deployment. So that's the technical sort of side of the test, and we're definitely hoping to be sharing quite soon some early results from that work in Uganda.
I look forward to the case studies, and it really does sound like the Utilities 2.0 is a sure way to open up the energy market, and it will definitely increase access. Kristina, before we conclude our discussion, I'd just like for you to tell us what you've learned about working about the real world experience of central and decentralized energy companies working together.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And, again, my start in the energy world was on the traditional side of things. I worked with the California Public Utilities Commission and locally on a program for Energy Star, which was a program of the Department of Energy. And what I can say is, above and beyond anything else, the interest in innovation, the goodwill that's at the table, working between UMEME and decentralized partners is unlike anything I've ever seen. I have never experienced a utility being so willing to embrace innovation in this way. So I think that's a pretty critical ingredient. It might bias some of my comments. But what I would say is we kind of settle on 5 Ps, if you will. So planning, products, policy, profits, and then people. And at the end of the day, when it comes to planning, in many ways, it's been a real eye-opener to see the decision process that, say, a mini grid company goes through or a rooftop company goes through in selecting a site and developing it versus the way a centralized grid approach does. And it's a completely different planning process, although it often intersects with the same stakeholders, so rural electrification agencies and in some case regulators. But seeing that approach, I think, has been really educational for both sides. And now the really interesting part is working on the technical integration. So in the case of the Uganda pilot, the goal is to move carefully and slowly and get to know each other as partners, but start with things like co-marketing and end up at the end of the day at integration of technologies. And so in about a year from now, we'll be hopefully interconnecting these development areas developed strictly through decentralized technologies to connect with the main grid. And even that in of itself is really enlivening a couple of eye-openers, including things like, the cost of meters or the cost of infrastructure for a utility that does mass purchasing versus what a decentralized company might do. So it's really been interesting to see that, and also just understanding the patchwork of regulations that all need to be in place. I think one of the things we've learned and all been surprised by, the core group of us working on this, is the incredible goodwill that isn't always reflected as it needs to be in policy. So all along the way, whether it's looking at interconnection policy or creating carve-outs in policy and a dedicated funding or connections goals for decentralized players, all of those things are super important, not just to make sure that we do have the right policy in place, but also because that sends a really important market signal for the decentralized community and, quite frankly, their investors. But at the end of the day, the most fascinating thing has been working together as people. Energy companies are made up of human beings, and what's been incredibly important is really developing close relationships amongst us all to develop that trust that you alluded to at the beginning of the conversation might be kind of missing between centralized and decentralized energy providers. But oriented towards that common goal is fantastic, and it's been a really incredible learning experience. But I would say that out of all the other topics, really focusing on a way that both companies, both types of companies, can make a profit and create a sustainable business out of advancing rural electrification is critical. But the people at the end of the day are probably one of the most important parts of learnings in this pilot. So I hope that answers your question. And I know we're about out of time, but it's just been such a pleasure to talk to you.
It's been great, and it sounds like you've made great relations, and you've also, these are great learnings that you have learned during this journey. And Kristina, I just want to say thank you for sharing insights on energy access development, and thank you to our viewers for watching.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Take care.